It's about following rules or creating happiness. Let's explore. From a very young age, we are introduced to these two words, right and good. In fact, these are the two words which form the basis of our understanding of the moral world. In fact, these two are the basic words we use when we're making moral decisions. And over a period of time, as we grow up, we tend to use the words quite loosely. In fact, we use the word right and good interchangeably. But in moral philosophy, in ethics, these words have very distinct meaning. In fact, these two words form the basis of our ethical decision making. In today's session, we will discuss the meaning of what is right, what is good, how they differ, how are they connected with each other, and lastly, we'll also discuss what philosophers had to say about the term right and good. Before we get into understanding the meaning of the word right and good, we need to understand why do we need to understand these terms? Is there a reason to understand these terms? Yes, there are reasons, and I'll give you three reasons. In ethics, the terms right and good help us to understand how to evaluate others' actions. That's one. Further, the terms right and good help us to understand when an action becomes morally acceptable. We need to understand the terms right and good because this helps us in making ethical decisions. For example, when we want our actions to be right, we tend to follow principles or we tend to follow our duties. When we want our actions or decisions to be good, we tend to look at the outcomes. Now, this is something that's going to help all of you in doing case studies. Knowing the meaning of the term right and good will give you better understanding of all the ethical theories. Let's get into understanding the concept of what is right. When somebody uses the word right, what does it mean? In fact, right refers to actions that perfectly align with moral principles or moral norms or your duties. In fact, right actions are those actions which actually sticks to a principle or a norm or a ethical rule. It will not focus on consequences. Right actions are those actions which are perfectly aligned with rules, codes, principles, or laws or duties. Now, for example, in our personal life, truth telling is non negotiable. Why? Because truth telling is supposed to be right action. Why? Because the concept of truth telling perfectly aligns with honesty. In ethics, the concept of right is best represented by Kant. In fact, Kant very famously created this concept called categorical imperative, where he talks about human actions become right only if they're aligned with principles which are universally acceptable and if they follow their duties in a non negotiable, uncompromising manner. The key points of deontological ethics are first, it focuses on following moral duties or rules. Second, an action is right if it fulfills a moral obligation. Third, the consequences of the action do not determine its morality. The key point here to be noted is the second one. An action is right. Look at the words. The action is right if it fulfills a moral obligation. On the other hand, the idea of good refers to outcomes of the action. Unlike right actions, which focused on principles and obligations, here the focus is more on benefits. Here the focus is what benefits the action will give to individuals or the society. So when I say good actions, I refer to only those actions which become morally acceptable because of the results they produce. Actions that lead to positive outcomes, such as happiness, well being, or reduction of suffering, are considered good. In moral philosophy, there's an approach called consequentialism. And this approach is the best representative of the idea of good. Because in this approach, they believe an action is right as long as it contributes to greatest happiness for greatest numbers. Good. And the best expounder or propounder of this school of thought happens to be J.S. Mill. And J.S. Mill very strongly advocated an action becomes morally acceptable as long as it contributes to good outcomes. The key points of consequentialism or consequential ethics are: first one, it focuses on outcomes of the action. Second, an action is good if it results in the greatest overall benefit. Third, the morality of an action is judged by its ability to maximize happiness or minimize harm. Look at the second point again: an action is good. So, the bottom line, right action deals with principles, good action deals with outcomes. When we speak of good, philosophers tend to distinguish between things that are intrinsically good and instrumentally good. For example, happiness is intrinsically good. Why? Because good in itself. But at the same time, there are things which are instrumentally good. Why? Because they help us or they act as an instrument to achieve something else. For example, money. Money is an instrumental good. It helps us to achieve other things. We looked at right and good from action and consequence perspective. For example, good is all about outcomes. How about something called good person? When you say that person is a good person, what does it mean? What does good mean vis-a-vis a person? This is where virtue ethics comes in. This is where we need to bring in Aristotle. Aristotle was very clear here. It's all about the person. In virtue ethics, a good person refers to an individual who practices virtues in his daily life. And these virtues can be honesty, generosity, wisdom, courage. A person who consistently acts with virtues is considered good, not just because of the outcomes of the actions, but because they live a virtuous life. Remember the last sentence. Not because of outcomes of the actions, but because they live a virtuous life. When it comes to virtue ethics, there are two key points one has to remember. One, it focuses on character of the individual. Two, goodness is not about outcomes. Goodness is about having virtues such as honesty, justice, and courage. Let's try to understand the difference behind right and good. The first major difference that everybody has to keep this in mind is this: one focuses on action and the other focuses on outcome. Right focuses on whether the action itself follows moral rules or duties. The action is judged independently of the results, while good focuses on the results or outcomes of the action. An action is judged by how much good, happiness, well being, etc. it brings. The second big difference refers to moral philosophical theories. The idea of right is central to deontological ethics, where moral action follows rules or duties, while the idea of good is central to consequentialist ethics, where the goodness of actions is based on their outcomes. Let's look at few examples to clarify the difference between right and good. Telling the truth, even if it causes harm, because it follows the duty of honesty, is right action. While lying to protect someone's life because it leads to positive outcome is an example of good action. A small activity for all of you. You know the meaning of right and good? You know the difference between these two? Just think and tell me, is there a connection between right and good? I'll give you a simple clue. The relationship entirely depends on the ethical theories you believe in. Suppose you're a consequentialist, the relationship will be different. Suppose you're a deontologist or a follower of Kantian ethics, the relationship will be different. Let's see that. For a utilitarian, the rightness of an action is determined by good outcomes. So it's the goodness of the outcomes that determines the moral worth of an action. So, in other words, an action becomes right only if it contributes to goodness. In Kantian ethics, the word right comes before good. In fact, Kantians believed an action has to be done for right reasons, irrespective of the outcomes. Just to add a philosophical flavor to the whole discussion, I'll talk about few philosophers and their views on right and good. The first philosopher I'm going to call on is Immanuel Kant. In Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant explains that actions are right when they follow a universal moral law, known as categorical imperative. For Kant, the consequences of an action don't matter. What is right because it follows a moral rule. Look at the last words. What is right because it follows a moral rule. That's Kant for you. Following Kant is the obvious J.S. Mill. In Utilitarianism, Mill argues that actions are good if they result in the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. For Mill, consequences are everything, and action is right if it leads to good outcome. Look at the last sentence again. Action is right if it leads to good outcomes. Towards the end, I'll call on a very interesting philosopher. A lot of you may not have heard about this gentleman. His name is W.D. Ross. He wrote a book, The Right and the Good. Interesting. He combines right and the good together. Ross tries to balance the two concepts by arguing that some actions are right because they follow moral duties, while others are right because they lead to good outcomes. So, kind of a balance here. Understanding these two basic terms of ethics, right and good, is very important if you have to understand ethical theories, if you have to understand how ethical decisions are made. In fact, understanding these two terms are very critical for your case study also. Because when you're developing case study options, or when you're developing, or when you're making ethical decisions in a case study, you have to go with right options or options that produce good outcomes. A simple reflective activity for all of you on the basis of today's discussion. Next time when you make a moral decision, or next time when you're stuck in a moral quandary, ask yourself this question. Am I focused on doing the right thing, or am I focused on getting good outcomes? Now, answer to this question will actually determine your approach to ethics. That is, it'll tell you how you look at ethics. Happy learning. See you all soon.